Around 1:30 a.m. on the 6th of November 1930, following a Guy Fawkes night dance in Northampton the previous evening, two men, Brown and Bailey, were returning home to the nearby village of Hardingstone. On the way, they spotted in the distance what they took to be a bonfire, which they did not think was unusual, thinking it was just part of the November the 5th festivities. As they continued their walk to the village, and also in the direction of the fire, a neatly dressed man carrying a briefcase passed them going in the opposite direction. When Brown remarked about the fire he could see in the distance, the stranger nodded and said, "It looks like somebody's having a bonfire up there," continuing to walk past the two men before turning in the direction of the main Northampton to London road. When Brown and Bailey turned a bend, they came across the source of the flames, and to their horror, discovered it was a car on the verge. The vehicle turned out to be a Morris Minor, and it was well alight. They hurried to Hardingstone, where they roused village constable Harry Copping to alert him to the fire. The three men returned to the car and extinguished it the best they could, using water from a nearby pond, only to discover a charred corpse lying across the front seat, with the head on what would be the driver's side, and the right arm burnt off at the elbow. Constable Copping would later recollect he had initially believed the skull of the victim was actually a scorched rugby ball. Crucially, a wooden mallet was found near to the car, with 3 human hairs attached, as well as an empty petrol can. Alfred Rouse was born in Herne Hill in London on the 6th of April 1894, one of 3 children born to an English father and an Irish mother. His father, Walter, was a shopkeeper, whereas his mother was an aspiring actress who deserted her husband and children in 1900. Rouse's father had little time for his children, so they were largely raised by an aunt. Leaving school at age 14, he worked briefly as an office boy, then found more secure employment at a textile manufacturing firm. He worked there for 5 years, before training as a carpenter, all the while furthering his education by attending numerous evening classes. In 1909, he obtained employment at a West End furniture maker. Soon after, he became acquainted with a young clerk named Lily Watkins, who he first met at a local dance, and with whom he began a relationship. After the outbreak of World War I, Rouse enlisted in the British Army as a private in the 24th Queen's Regiment. While training in England, he married his fiancée Lily. Arriving in France in March 1915, he was stationed in Paris for some weeks before his unit was sent into battle. He is known to have fathered an illegitimate child during this time. In a bayonet attack, Rouse came face to face with a German soldier and lunged at him, but missed. The memory of waiting for just an instant for the enemy riposte would remain with him for the rest of his life, and his sleep would be plagued by nightmares. A few weeks later, he sustained wounds to his head, knee, and thigh from a high-explosive shell which exploded close by, sending numerous fragments of shrapnel into his head and leg and rendering him unconscious for several days, and he remained hospitalized for almost a year, undergoing several operations. Rouse's leg injuries left him unable to bend his knee and affected his ability to walk. After a lengthy recuperation, he was formally discharged in February 1916 and awarded a military pension of 25 shillings a week. He returned to live with his wife in Stoke Newington. In July, Rouse's doctor noted that his memory was defective and that he was unable to wear a hat of any kind because of the scar around his skull, which was irritable, although his speech and writing abilities were unaffected. He complained that he was suffering from bad memory and to be suffering from insomnia. During July 1919, he was past fit enough to return to work, and his pension was reduced to 12 shillings a week. A final examination revealed his head injury had completely healed, and the limitations of his knee movement had decreased dramatically. His pension was terminated the following month, and he received a final lump sum payment of £45.05 in settlement of all his injury claims. Beginning in 1920, he undertook a number of jobs which required a degree of physical exertion. Many of these involved the use of vehicles, resulting in Rouse becoming a moderately skilled mechanic. The same year, he also began to conduct illicit affairs, in which he, posing as a single man, seduced any woman he found attractive. The first was a 14-year-old Edinburgh girl, who became pregnant when she reached 15 and was promptly abandoned, leaving her to give birth to their child in a home for unwed mothers. 4 years later, in 1925, Rouse began an affair with a Hendon-based maid called Nellie Tucker. In 1928, Tucker gave birth to a baby girl and obtained a child support order, the first of many by various women, against Rouse. In June 1929, he got a job as a commercial traveller for a Leicester-based company, Martins & Co., and initially his patch was the South Coast and the Midlands, earning £4 a week, with expenses paid each Friday, and a sales commission paid every month. He managed to earn sufficient money for him and his wife to obtain a mortgage on a house in the London borough of Barnet, and a year later he bought a 1928 Morris Minor. The fact that his job required him to travel extensively across the country throughout 1929 and 1930, he is known to have conducted a number of affairs with women, both married and single, whom he typically encountered through his employment. Many of them came from poor backgrounds and would be deceived by Rouse's charismatic personality, his fabrications of being a wealthy London entrepreneur, and his promises of marriage. He is known to have bigamously married at least 3 of these women. As a result of these affairs, Rouse fathered a number of illegitimate children. By the summer of 1930, he had already had one child support order imposed on him by Tucker, with whom he had been conducting an affair for several years, and she was now pregnant with their second child, and fully expecting him to marry her. A young Welshwoman named Phyllis Jenkins was also pregnant, and was also fully expecting marriage in the near future. Rouse also faced several other impending child support order cases from women across the country and from one woman in Paris. Inevitably, this was putting a strain on Rouse and his finances. At what point he decided on his plan is not entirely known, or how he arrived at it. He did mention that initially he had begun to think about committing a murder in which he could fake his own death, after he had read an account of the murder of a Scottish barmaid named Agnes Keeson, who had been murdered near Epsom in June 1930, and whose murder would ultimately remain unsolved. He wanted to make a new start, and to ensure the financial stability of his legal wife and his 6-year-old son. He took out a life insurance policy for £1,000 in his name a few months before he put his plan into action, which would pay out in the event of the accidental death of the owner-driver of his vehicle. This policy named his legal wife as the beneficiary, and early on he began the search for a man of roughly the same age and build as himself. He had previously become casually acquainted at a pub named the Swan and Pyramid with a man who had told Rouse a hard-luck story, claiming that he had no family and that nobody in the world cares whether he lived or died. In reply, Rouse informed the man that through his employment as a commercial traveller, he would be able to secure a job for him in the Midlands, and that he would be travelling there on the 5th of November. Rouse specifically opted to time the fire in his car to be on Guy Fawkes night, as the fire would not be noticed as much due to the typical bonfire celebrations, and that his victim had readily agreed to accompany him with the promise of finding work. To minimise any resistance from his victim, Rouse also bought the man a bottle of whiskey to consume as they travelled north. A later forensic examination of the vehicle revealed a joint on the pipe between the petrol tank and the carburettor of the car had been loosened before the fire had ignited, allowing petrol to freely stream both into and underneath the car, indicating the blaze had been deliberate. The victim had been alive, although unconscious, at the time the fire started, and was estimated to have died within 30 seconds. He was thought to have been between 33 and 37 years old. Police visited Rouse's Barnet home to interview his wife, who was able to confirm her husband had left home at approximately 8:30 p.m. on the 5th to attend a business meeting in Leicester, and that he had arrived home at a time she, incorrectly, believed to be approximately 2 a.m. the following morning. She was then asked to accompany police to Northampton to assist in the identification of the victim. Due to the actual condition of the remains, she was not allowed to see the body, but instead asked to confirm whether she could identify scraps of clothing and a wallet containing 30 shillings, which had been found on the victim. Mrs. Rouse stated the items of clothing looked those her husband had worn, but she could not be certain. But the wallet had definitely belonged to her husband. Rouse had managed to get a lift to London, arriving at his home at around 6 a.m. He had left after half an hour before travelling by train to Glamorganshire to meet with Phyllis Jenkins, who he had earlier promised to marry. When Jenkins asked Rouse where his car was, he replied it had been stolen the previous day, and that this was why it had taken him 18 hours to reach her. He assured her that he had reported the theft to both the police and his insurance company. But the following morning, Rouse's mistress showed him a newspaper with a picture of his burned-out car, which speculated as to whether the deceased occupant had been the owner, and questioning whether he had been murdered. Rouse denied the car was his, before announcing his intention to travel by coach back to London. When the coach had departed, Jenkins informed local police that he had been at her house and of his intended destination. The police in turn informed the Metropolitan Police of his whereabouts. That evening, Rouse was arrested at Hammersmith Coach Terminal by Detective Sergeant Skelly, who had been waiting for him to arrive. At the police station, Rouse was informed that officers from Northamptonshire Police were already travelling to London to interview him. He gave a rambling statement in which he claimed his victim was a hitchhiker he had encountered near St Albans, and who had accidentally set his vehicle alight while he had left the car for a few moments to relieve himself. He further claimed he was travelling to Scotland Yard to confess to his crime at the time of his arrest, adding, "I am glad it's all over. I was going to Scotland Yard about it. I was responsible. I have had no sleep." With the arrival of Northamptonshire police officers, he was cautioned and driven back north. Now a suspect, he contradicted his earlier statement by claiming that he had encountered the victim hitchhiking along the Great North Road towards the Midlands and had offered him a lift. He had driven to Hardingstone accidentally because he had lost his way. Stopping the car to answer a call of nature, he had asked his travelling companion, whom he had given a cigar, to fill the car's petrol tank from a can in the boot. According to Rouse, when he looked back, the vehicle was ablaze, with the man trapped inside. He had, he claimed, attempted to open the door of the vehicle, but had been beaten back by the flames. In a state of panic, he had fled from the scene. When confronted with the forensic evidence that the pipe between the petrol tank and the carburettor of the vehicle had been tampered with, Rouse remained adamant the fire had been accidental, offering the theory it may have been started by the inebriated victim lighting the cigar he had been given after he had filled the petrol tank of the car and accidentally spilt petrol inside the vehicle. When questioned as to why he had been seen by the two men walking from the scene of the fire with a briefcase in his hand, he claimed he had taken the briefcase out of the car because he had earlier noticed the man had been eyeing it. On the 27th of November, Rouse appeared at Northampton Assizes to be formally charged with the murder of an unknown man. He was remanded into custody until his trial on the 26th of January. The trial, which lasted 6 days, was held at the Northampton Winter Assizes, and Rouse formally pleaded not guilty to the charge of the murder of an unknown man. Throughout his trial, he stuck to his claim that the death had been accidental. The defence introduced an engineer who testified that in many instances, excessive heat in a burning car would invariably result in the loosening of the joint on the feeding pipe, and as such, the contention the victim had inadvertently set the vehicle ablaze could be true. This claim was refuted by both pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury and Dr. Eric Shaw, who had together performed an autopsy on the victim and who were each called to testify on behalf of the prosecution. Both men testified that the victim had been alive but unconscious when the fire had been started, and that the mallet found near the car had likely been the weapon used to club the victim on the head prior to the start of the fire. A prosecution witness to refute the accidental death theory was a vehicle expert who had studied the remains of the Morris Minor and testified that a joint on the feeding pipe between the petrol tank and the carburettor had been forcibly loosened to allow petrol to flow into and beneath the car, discrediting earlier defence claims that excessive heat in a burning car would invariably result in the loosening of this particular joint. The prosecution's contention was that the actual motive behind Rouse's committing this murder had been to fabricate his own death in order that he could escape the financial constraints brought about by his numerous affairs, and 3 of his mistresses were called to testify. The jury reached their verdict after 25 minutes, and Rouse was found unanimously found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. He did lodge an appeal, which was heard a few weeks later, but it was turned down. The murder was notable because the identity of the victim has never been established, resulting in the accused being tried, convicted, and executed for the murder of an unknown man. Despite recent DNA testing, the identity of the victim still remains unknown. Rouse never formally admitted his guilt to the murder, although shortly before his execution, he did write a letter to the Daily Sketch, in which he indicated he had done it. He wrote that initially he had resisted the thoughts to commit a murder in which he could fabricate his own death, although a chance encounter with the unknown man in a London pub in the autumn of 1930 had led him to rethink his plans. On the day in question, Rouse, after torching the car, had intended to walk to Northampton and travel to Scotland by train to begin life afresh. When he had seen the 2 men walking down the road at the end of Hardingstone Lane, he realised people would see that he was not the victim in the car. So, after briefly returning to his London home with a hastily concocted story of his car having been stolen, he had opted to travel to Glamorganshire to meet with one of his mistresses. When he read the extensive accounts of the murder in the Welsh press, in which he was named as the prime suspect, he had travelled back to London, where he had been arrested. In this confession, published after his execution, Rouse coldly said that he had never asked his victim's name, claiming there was no reason why he should do so. In the days prior to his execution, his legal wife and two of his mistresses individually visited him to bid a final farewell. He was hanged on Tuesday the 10th of March, 1931. The remains of Rouse's victim were buried in a grave marked with a simple cross bearing the inscription, "In memory of an unknown man, died November the 6th, 1930, and rests in the graveyard of St. Edmund's Church in Hardingstone, Northamptonshire."